Imagine a force so silent, so lethal, that the enemy refused to believe they were even human. In the suffocating heat of the Vietnamese jungle, the Viet Cong had a name for them: Ma Rung, the Phantoms. We're not talking about a massive army. We're talking about just 100 men, 100 Australians who struck more raw, paralyzing terror into the hearts of the VC than 10,000 heavily armed U.S. Marines combined. How is that possible? How did a tiny group of SAS operators turn the hunter into the hunted, moving through the bush like shadows, leaving behind nothing but a trail of silent kills and a legend that still haunts the veterans of the North? The Americans brought the noise. The Australians brought the nightmare. Today, we are peeling back the canopy on the most terrifying tactics ever used in the Long Tan era. I've gathered the declassified details and the chilling accounts that explain why the VC feared the Ma Rung more than any carpet bomb or artillery strike. Stick with me until the very end, because I'm going to reveal the one specific SAS survival secret that forced the Viet Cong High Command to change their entire strategy or face total extinction in the bush. This is the untold story of the Australian SAS. Let's get into the wire. Why were the American forces, with all their technological might and endless supplies, being picked off like targets in a shooting gallery while the Australians seemed untouchable? The answer was as simple as it was scandalous. The American soldiers smelled like a suburban shopping mall in the middle of a primeval forest. To the hypersensitive nostrils of a seasoned Viet Cong scout, a United States platoon carried the unmistakable alien scent of Irish Spring soap, peppermint toothpaste, and the chemical tang of high-end mosquito repellent. This olfactory signature drifted for hundreds of yards through the heavy, humid air, acting as a literal early warning system for an enemy that was always watching, always sniffing, always ready. In the thick tropical heat of Phuoc Tuy Province, an American patrol might as well have been marching through the jungle with a flashing neon sign strapped to their helmets. But this was only the first blow to the traditional military ego. The elite operators of the Australian Special Air Service looked at this tactical disaster and decided on a radical, stomach-turning solution that would leave modern observers in total shock. They recognized that cleanliness in the bush was a direct invitation to an early and permanent departure from this world, so they implemented a repulsive ritual known among insiders as the smell doctrine. For 2 full weeks before venturing beyond the safety of the wire into the primary conflict zone, every single member of the patrol completely abandoned all forms of hygiene. They rejected soap, threw away their razors, and allowed their natural body oils to saturate their tattered uniforms until they reeked of the very earth they were trying to protect. They stopped brushing their teeth, they stopped washing their hands, and they let the accumulated filth of the Australian bush camp seep into every pore of their skin until their own comrades could barely stand to sit next to them at the mess table. This was not a lack of discipline, not some crude display of toughness, but a calculated, deliberate transformation into a predator that the jungle itself would accept as one of its own. Yet this nauseating disguise was merely the foundation for a much more lethal secret. To complete this biological camouflage, the Australians went to lengths that many considered absolutely scandalous and beyond the pale of civilized warfare. They did not just stop washing. They actively sought out the most pungent, revolting local scents to mask their foreign origin from the enemy's nose. They would intentionally drench their gear and skin in nuoc mam, the fermented, rotting fish sauce that was a staple of every Vietnamese village kitchen, and rub handfuls of jungle mud, crushed leaves, and local spices into their pores until their bodies produced an odor so foul that it would make a dumpster behind a Saigon fish market smell like a French perfume counter. By the time they stepped into the deep brush, they did not just blend into the foliage, they became an organic, indistinguishable part of the jungle's own rotting ecosystem. A Viet Cong scout could be standing a mere 3 feet away, and his nose would tell him he was smelling nothing more dangerous than a patch of decaying vegetation or a local farmer returning from the rice paddies. But the science behind this stinking protocol was about to reveal a truth that the Pentagon never wanted to hear. The tropical humidity of Vietnam acted as a scent amplifier of terrifying efficiency, carrying chemical molecules through the stagnant, moisture-saturated air with a reach that no laboratory could replicate. Military researchers would later confirm that a single drop of Western aftershave lotion could create a detectable scent corridor stretching over 400 yards in the right atmospheric conditions. The Viet Cong scouts who operated in these forests were not ordinary soldiers. Many of them had grown up hunting wild game in the triple canopy wilderness since childhood, and they possessed an olfactory sensitivity to foreign chemicals that rivaled a bloodhound's ability to track a fugitive through the swamps of Louisiana. Captured guerrilla fighters confirmed during the interrogation that they could routinely detect the approach of an American patrol by smell alone, often 15 to 20 minutes before any visual or acoustic contact was made. Against such natural detection systems, the standard issue bottle of Army insect repellent was not just a comfort item. It was a homing beacon that guided enemy ambushes with devastating pinpoint accuracy. And yet, the most devastating part of this equation was what it revealed about the fundamental clash of philosophy between the two allied forces. The Americans were trying to bring civilization into the jungle. They hauled in portable showers, stocked their forward bases with branded hygiene products, and insisted on maintaining the grooming standards of a peacetime garrison even in the most hostile terrain on the planet. Every bar of soap, every tube of shaving cream, every aerosol can of insect repellent represented a philosophical choice that the generals in Washington never questioned. Comfort over survival, familiarity over adaptation, the illusion of normalcy over the brutal reality of the bush. The Australians understood something that no amount of Pentagon spending could buy. They understood that the jungle was not a battlefield to be conquered with technology. It was a living, breathing organism that would betray any foreign body it detected within its ecosystem. The SAS men chose the opposite path from their American allies. They chose to become the jungle, to dissolve the boundary between soldier and swamp, between hunter and habitat. And in doing so, they became invisible to the enemy's most ancient and most reliable detection system, the human nose. It was a victory of adaptation over arrogance, and it was only the first of many lessons that the world's most powerful military was too proud to learn. If the stench of the forest phantoms was a nightmare for the enemy, their absolute mastery of silence was a total impossibility in the world of 20th century combat. The Australians treated sound the way a demolition expert treats nitroglycerin, with obsessive, fanatical, almost religious respect for its terrifying power to cause instant, irreversible catastrophe. One careless clink of metal against metal, one dry twig snapping under a boot, one involuntary cough suppressed half a second too late, and 5 men would cease to exist in a storm of AK-47 fire from an enemy they never even saw. In the suffocating green darkness of the Vietnamese triple canopy, sound was not just a tactical consideration. It was the difference between walking back through the wire at Nui Dat and vanishing forever into the anonymous mud of a foreign jungle. The standard American approach to the same problem could not have been more dramatically, almost comically different. The doctrine of search and destroy relied on overwhelming volume, both in terms of firepower and sheer acoustic presence. A typical American infantry company on the move generated a noise signature that a trained Viet Cong listener could detect from over a kilometer away. The clanking of aluminum canteens bouncing against steel ammunition pouches, the rhythmic thudding of heavy jungle boots on packed laterite earth, the metallic rattle of M16 rifles knocking against flak jackets with every step, the constant crackle of multiple PRC-25 radio handsets broadcasting on open frequencies, and above all, the unmistakable sound of 200 young men from Ohio, Texas, and California talking, arguing, cursing the heat, and complaining about the chow in voices that carried through the canopy like a live broadcast from Armed Forces Radio Saigon. This was not a failure of discipline or a sign of incompetence. It was the logical, unavoidable consequence of a doctrine that valued speed, aggression, and overwhelming firepower over the ancient patient arts of stealth and concealment. But this was only the acoustic half of the scandal that was about to shake the foundations of American military thinking. Every single piece of equipment carried by an Australian SAS patrol was subjected to a ritualistic pre-mission inspection that bordered on the pathological. The process began 72 hours before departure and consumed more time than the actual weapons cleaning. Metal dog tags, those iconic symbols of the American fighting man, were taped together with thick black electrical tape so they could not produce even the faintest metallic clink during a midnight stalk through enemy-held bamboo thickets. Standard issue metal buckles on webbing and harnesses were removed entirely and replaced with silent fabric ties that could be fastened and released without a sound. Rifle magazines were loaded one round short of full capacity to prevent the compressed spring from producing a telltale rattle when the patrol moved through rough terrain. Weapons were carried with the safety catch engaged and the sling wrapped tight against the body to eliminate any possibility of the barrel tapping against a canteen or a pouch during a sudden change of direction. Even the most mundane items in the patrol kit were subjected to this fanatical acoustic audit. The medical kit was completely unpacked and reassembled so that individual bandages, morphine syringes, and surgical instruments could not shift, tap, or rub against each other inside the pouch during the movement. Water canteens were wrapped in strips of cloth to dampen any sloshing sound from partially filled containers. Compass cases were padded with strips of cut rubber. Grenades were secured to the webbing with additional tape to prevent the safety spoons from vibrating against the body of the munition. One veteran SAS operator later revealed that his patrol leader once sent a man back from the departure point because his bootlace eyelets were producing a barely perceptible squeak that could only be heard in total silence from a distance of 2 feet. That level of obsession would have been considered clinical madness in any other army on the planet, but in the Australian SAS, it was the basic minimum standard for staying alive. Yet the true mastery lay not in the silencing of equipment, but in the extraordinary science of the human footstep itself. The movement of these Australian phantoms through the jungle was a cold-blooded and precise discipline of kinetic invisibility that remains unmatched by any special operations force to this day. While a regular infantryman might crash through the undergrowth like a startled water buffalo, breaking dry twigs and rustling dead leaves with every careless stride, the Rung operators utilized a specialized heel-to-toe roll that allowed a 200-pound man loaded with 25 kilograms of combat equipment to move with the acoustic signature of a falling leaf. The technique required the lead scout to lower his forward foot in an excruciatingly slow, controlled arc, making contact first with the outer edge of the heel, then gradually transferring his full body weight along the length of the sole, while simultaneously feeling through the thin rubber of his modified jungle boot for any dry twig, loose pebble, or brittle bamboo shard that might produce a snap. If the toe detected an obstacle, the foot was lifted with agonizing slowness and repositioned without ever completing the step. A single careless footfall, a single crack of dried wood echoing through the silent canopy could betray the entire patrol's position and trigger a contact that would mean the permanent end of 5 men's stories. The result was a pace of movement that would have driven an American battalion commander to the absolute edge of professional despair. A 5-man SAS patrol moving through dense secondary growth might cover as little as 100 yards in a full hour of continuous movement. 100 yards, an American infantry platoon could cover the same distance in under 2 minutes at a standard tactical walk. But the Australians were not interested in speed, because speed in the Vietnamese jungle was just another word for noise, and noise was just another word for a body bag on the next helicopter back to Saigon. That glacial, maddening, patience-destroying pace bought something infinitely more valuable than rapid ground coverage. It bought total acoustic invisibility, the ability to pass through an enemy-controlled landscape like a ripple of warm air, leaving behind no sound, no trace, and no indication that a human being had ever been present. But the genius of the Australian approach to silence went far beyond the mere suppression of man-made noise. The jungle itself became their most powerful ally in this invisible war against detection. The SAS operators learned to synchronize their movement with the natural rhythmic soundtrack of the Vietnamese forest in a way that transformed the environment from a neutral backdrop into an active instrument of concealment. When the cicadas reached their peak volume in the late afternoon, filling the canopy with a deafening wall of insect noise that could drown out a conversation at 5 paces, the patrol would increase its pace slightly, using the biological chorus as acoustic cover to make faster progress through difficult terrain. When the jungle fell into one of its periodic eerie silences, a phenomenon that occurred several times each day as sudden temperature shifts altered insect behavior and caused entire populations of cicadas and crickets to pause simultaneously, the patrol would freeze in place like a formation of living statues and wait, sometimes for 15 or 20 minutes, until the natural noise floor rose again before resuming movement. They learned to read the acoustic environment with the same precision that their Aboriginal trained trackers read the visual one. A sudden cessation of birdsong in the canopy ahead could indicate the presence of a human being who had disturbed the local avian population. The alarm call of a specific species of jungle fowl meant something different from the warning cry of a hornbill. Even the behavior of frogs in a nearby stream provided actionable intelligence. Certain species would fall silent when they detected the vibrations of approaching footsteps through the saturated earth, and the SAS men learned to use this amphibian early warning system to detect enemy movement long before any human sense could have registered a threat. They were not merely walking through the jungle, they were surfing its sonic waves like a master surfer riding the ocean, perfectly balanced within the ambient noise of their environment, invisible not because they made no sound, but because every sound they made was camouflaged within the vast, living orchestra of the forest itself. The cumulative effect of this acoustic discipline on the enemy's psychological state was nothing short of devastating. Viet Cong sentries posted along known infiltration routes would complete their watch shifts and report to their commanders that the night had passed without incident, that nothing had moved through their sector, that the jungle had been perfectly still and perfectly silent. And then, the following morning, they would discover that their comrades in a position 300 meters to the south had been eliminated during the night by a force that had passed directly through the sentry line without producing a single detectable sound. The sentries had not failed in their duty. They had not fallen asleep. They had been alert, vigilant, and listening with every fiber of their being. The Australians had simply moved through their position the way a shadow moves across a wall, present, but producing no physical evidence of its passage that any human sense could detect. This was the second pillar of the Ma Rung legend, and it was about to be reinforced by a third weapon even more terrifying than silence: the ability to communicate complex tactical information across a 5-man patrol without a single member ever opening his mouth. In a theater of war where communication between soldiers typically meant shouting over the deafening roar of helicopter rotors, screaming coordinates into a crackling radio handset, or barking orders across a clearing while tracer rounds split the air overhead, the Australians operated in a realm of absolute chilling, almost monastic muteness. The Special Air Service had developed and mastered an incredibly complex silent language consisting of over 120 distinct hand and body signals, a vocabulary of gesture so rich and so nuanced that it allowed a 5-man patrol to plan, coordinate, and execute intricate multi-directional ambushes without a single human syllable being uttered for periods stretching up to 14 consecutive days, 14 days of total vocal silence. Not a whisper to confirm a direction of march, not a murmur to acknowledge an order, not even a barely audible hiss to warn of danger. For 2 full weeks, these men functioned as a single tactical organism using nothing but the subtle movement of fingers, hands, rifle barrels, and body posture to transmit information that would normally require a full radio net and a dedicated signals operator. This system went so far beyond the basic military hand signals taught at infantry schools around the Western world that it belonged to an entirely different category of human communication. The standard NATO hand signal vocabulary consisted of roughly 20 to 30 gestures covering elementary commands like stop, go, enemy ahead, and rally point. The Australian SAS version included specialized gestures for identifying specific types of enemy equipment spotted on a trail, indicating the estimated freshness of boot prints or campfire ashes, communicating the precise direction and speed of prevailing wind for scent drift calculations, and even signaling abstract tactical concepts like withdraw slowly to the southwest or hold current position indefinitely until further notice. Some signals were so subtle that they involved nothing more than a slight shift in the angle at which a rifle barrel was held, or a barely perceptible change in the way a man distributed his weight between his 2 feet. Operators who had trained together for months in the unforgiving Australian bush developed an almost telepathic rapport, anticipating each other's tactical intentions from the smallest physical cue, the way a veteran jazz ensemble anticipates the next chord change from a barely perceptible nod of the bandleader's head. It was not communication in the traditional military sense. It was something closer to the coordinated movement of a wolf pack on the hunt, where each member instinctively understands its role and adjusts its position in real time without any visible or audible command from the alpha. But the Australians had sealed yet another channel of detection that most armies had never even considered a vulnerability. The patrol radios, those indispensable lifelines that every other unit in Vietnam treated as a permanent open connection to the safety of artillery support and helicopter extraction, were carried by the SAS as instruments of absolute last resort. The radio was switched on only in two scenarios: a genuine life or death emergency requiring immediate extraction, or the transmission of intelligence so critical and so time-sensitive that it could not possibly wait for the patrol's return to base. Even when a transmission was unavoidable, the operator would speak in a whisper so faint that it was barely audible to the man kneeling directly beside him, compressing complex tactical information into brevity codes that reduced a full situation report to a burst of just 3 to 5 seconds of airtime. The antenna was shielded with the operator's own body and angled to minimize its electromagnetic signature, because the Viet Cong had become increasingly sophisticated at using captured Soviet-made direction-finding equipment to triangulate the origin of Allied radio transmissions and dispatch ambush teams to the coordinates within minutes. Every conceivable avenue of detection, acoustic, olfactory, electromagnetic, and visual, was sealed shut with a level of paranoid thoroughness that the American liaison officers found simultaneously admirable and profoundly unsettling. The Ma Rung had not merely reduced their signature, they had effectively erased themselves from every spectrum of human and electronic perception. However, even this extraordinary mastery of silence and invisibility was nothing compared to the most terrifying weapon in the entire Australian SAS arsenal, the raw, inhuman, almost supernatural power of total stillness. The sheer, agonizing psychological pressure that these elite operators applied to the enemy was not just about pulling a trigger at the right moment. It was a total, systematic, methodical breaking of the human spirit through the weaponization of time itself. While standard infantry units measured the success of their patrols in miles covered and terrain seized, the men of the SAS measured their effectiveness by the hours of absolute, crushing, bone-grinding stillness they could endure in the humid shadows of the jungle floor. Imagine the terrifying level of discipline required to melt into the environment during a classic L-shaped ambush, where 5 men arrange themselves in a geometric formation designed to create overlapping fields of fire and then simply cease to exist as living, breathing, moving human beings. They did not just wait for the enemy to appear, they became a permanent, haunting fixture of the landscape, prepared to remain as motionless as fallen logs for 3, 4, or even 5 full days without a single voluntary twitch of a single muscle fiber. Can any modern observer truly comprehend the level of raw physical suffering these men accepted as a standard part of their daily operational routine in the late 1960s? As they lay in their concealed positions, pressed flat against the rotting jungle floor with their faces half submerged in stagnant rainwater, giant weaver ants would discover their exposed skin and begin to crawl in disciplined columns across their open, unblinking eyelids, biting down with mandibles that delivered a sharp, burning sting with every contact. Not a single muscle would twitch in response. Poisonous centipedes the length of a man's forearm and venomous spiders with leg spans wider than a spread hand would slide into their tattered, sweat-soaked shirts, crawling across their necks and down their spines, seeking warmth in the damp fabric, while the men remained as cold and rigid as carved statues of gray stone. The relentless monsoon rains would arrive without warning, transforming the ground beneath their bodies into a putrid, sucking swamp that threatened to pull them down into the earth itself. But the Australian Phantom would simply breathe with the slow, rhythmic pulse of the forest, controlling his respiration to just 6 shallow breaths per minute, waiting with a cold, reptilian focus for the exact microsecond when the enemy would feel most secure and most vulnerable. But the preparation for this inhuman endurance began long before the patrol ever crossed the wire into enemy territory. The physiological groundwork for sustained multi-day immobility was itself a closely guarded regimental secret that the SAS shared with no other Allied force in Vietnam. 48 hours before deploying on a long-duration ambush mission, every member of the patrol would switch to a carefully calculated diet consisting exclusively of specific combinations of dried rations, electrolyte concentrates, and binding agents designed to minimize the body's need for waste elimination during the critical operational window. They trained their bladders and bowels through a progressive regime of delayed relief that civilian doctors would have considered borderline medically dangerous. Muscular endurance for sustained static positions was built through a brutal incremental training program that began with 6-hour motionless holds in the training areas of Campbell Barracks back in Perth, Western Australia, and gradually extended over months of selection and continuation training to the full multi-day periods required in the operational theater. The men learned to manage the excruciating pain of muscle cramps, pressure sores, and restricted blood circulation through a combination of micro-movements so tiny they were invisible from a distance of 2 feet, and a mental discipline that owed more to the meditation practices of Buddhist monks than to anything in the traditional Western military training manual. Yet the psychological dimension of the weight was perhaps even more punishing than the physical one, and it held a dark secret that military psychologists would spend decades trying to understand. For a man lying in an ambush position for 72 continuous hours straight, with no movement, no conversation, and no relief from the crushing pressure of hypervigilance, enters a mental state that clinical psychologists would later compare to a form of controlled dissociation. The conscious, rational, everyday mind gradually retreats from the foreground of awareness, and a deeper, more primitive layer of perception takes over, one that processes raw sensory information without the civilizing filter of rational thought, social conditioning, or moral judgment. The SAS operators had a name for this state. They called it going bush, a deceptively casual Australian slang term for a psychological transformation that was anything but casual. In the going bush state, the boundary between the individual self and the surrounding environment began to dissolve in ways that the men found difficult to articulate after the fact. They reported being able to hear the individual footsteps of a column of ants marching in formation across a fallen leaf 20 feet from their position. They could detect the subtle, almost imperceptible change in barometric pressure that preceded a human body displacing air as it moved through dense vegetation at a distance of 50 meters. Their pupils dilated to a degree that allowed them to perceive movement in near total darkness that would have been invisible to a normal human eye. They became, in a very real and measurable neurological sense, extensions of the jungle itself, biological sensors wired directly into the ecosystem with no barrier between stimulus and response. The tactical effect of this weaponized patience on the enemy's operational capability and psychological resilience was nothing short of catastrophic. While the Viet Cong were accustomed to fighting an opponent that arrived with the thunder of helicopter rotors, struck with the chaos of automatic weapons fire, and retreated within hours to the safety of a fortified fire base, the Australians presented a threat of an entirely different and far more terrifying nature. They were an enemy that arrived in silence, struck without warning, and then did not leave. They lingered in the shadows like a persistent, invisible, malevolent presence that could not be located, could not be engaged, and could not be escaped. They would wait until the Viet Cong unit had fully entered the center of the engagement zone, often allowing the lead scouts and point men to pass by their concealed positions unmolested, deliberately letting the enemy move deeper and deeper into the fatal arc to ensure that the maximum possible number of targets were committed to the trap before the first trigger was pulled. This cold-blooded, almost mechanical commitment to the perfect ambush turned every single square inch of the forest in the Australian tactical area of responsibility into a potential site of instantaneous, inescapable catastrophe for the communist forces. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers operating in Phuoc Thai province gradually came to understand that they could no longer trust any stretch of trail, any river crossing, any jungle clearing, or any overnight camp position to be safe from the invisible presence of the Rung. The result was a total cascading collapse of enemy morale and operational tempo in the Australian sector that no amount of B-52 carpet bombing or search and destroy sweeping had ever come close to achieving. The guerrillas who had spent years mastering the art of hiding from conventional forces now found themselves on the receiving end of a predatory patience so extreme that it redefined their understanding of what a human enemy was capable of enduring. They were being hunted by something that appeared to feel no pain, no fatigue, no hunger, and no mercy. But the real shock was about to come when the cold, hard mathematics behind these terrifying methods finally landed on the polished mahogany desks of the Pentagon. The statistics that eventually filtered back from the Australian Tactical Area of Operations and landed on the polished mahogany desks of the Pentagon were so wildly, outrageously skewed that the senior analysts who first reviewed them were absolutely convinced they were looking at either a clerical error of monumental proportions or a deliberate, shameless fabrication designed to embarrass the United States High Command. While American infantry units operating across Vietnam were struggling to maintain an engagement ratio of roughly 10-1, a figure that was considered highly respectable and efficient by the traditional standards of modern industrialized warfare, the Australian SAS were quietly, methodically producing results that belonged in the realm of pure military fantasy. The official Australian SAS effectiveness ratio for the Vietnam conflict was calculated at a staggering, almost incomprehensible 500-1. 500 enemy combatants permanently removed from the battlefield for every single Australian SAS operator lost during the entire course of the war. How could a tiny force of only a few hundred specialized men operating in small patrols of 4 or 5 cause more verified structural damage to the North Vietnamese military infrastructure than a full division of 10,000 heavily armed, lavishly supported United States Marines? The answer lay not in superior firepower, not in advanced technology, and certainly not in numerical advantage, but in the terrifying surgical efficiency of their target selection methodology. The SAS did not waste precious ammunition on low-value foot soldiers carrying rice bags through the jungle, or teenage conscripts manning remote listening posts along forgotten trails. They identified and specifically targeted the enemy's irreplaceable command and communication architecture. Battalion and regimental officers, intelligence couriers carrying documents between headquarters, signals operators who maintain the fragile radio networks linking dispersed guerrilla units, and political commissars whose removal would cripple the ideological cohesion of entire formations for weeks or even months. A single 5-man SAS patrol eliminating a Viet Cong regimental commander and his 2 senior staff officers in a 15-second ambush caused more lasting operational disruption to the communist war effort than an entire day of B-52 arc-light carpet bombing across a grid square that the enemy had already vacated 12 hours before the first bomb fell. But the weapon that made the surgical precision possible was itself a scandalous rejection of everything the American military believed about modern combat technology. While the United States had enthusiastically adopted the lighter, faster-firing M16 assault rifle, a weapon specifically designed for the spray-and-pray doctrine of suppressive fire that dominated American infantry tactics, the Australians stubbornly clung to their heavier, harder-hitting L1A1 self-loading rifle with a defiance that baffled and occasionally infuriated their American allies. The L1A1 was louder, significantly heavier, and carried a smaller magazine of only 20 rounds compared to the M16's 30, all of which were considered critical, disqualifying disadvantages in the American tactical philosophy of the era. But the Australians did not need a high rate of fire because they almost never missed. Each trigger pull was a deliberate, carefully aimed shot delivered from a concealed, stable firing position at a range where the L1A1's heavier 7.6 2mm NATO round gave it a decisive war-winning advantage over the M16's lightweight 5.56mm bullet. The M16 round was notorious among frontline troops for being deflected by even light jungle vegetation. A bamboo stalk, a thick palm frond, or a tangle of hanging vines could send the smaller bullet tumbling off course and into the canopy, completely missing the intended target. The L-1A1's larger, heavier round punched through leaves, branches, bamboo, and even light earthen cover with the ruthless, unstoppable efficiency of a freight train plowing through a picket fence. Yet even the rifle comparison was merely a symptom of a much deeper and more scandalous disparity that the Pentagon was desperate to keep quiet. The economies of force revealed by the raw ammunition expenditure data painted a picture so embarrassing to the American war effort that it should have triggered an immediate top-to-bottom revolution in United States tactical doctrine. In a single calendar year of operations, the entire Australian SAS regiment deployed in Vietnam expended fewer total rounds of rifle and machine gun ammunition than a single American infantry company of 160 men consumed in a single week of standard search and destroy operations. Yet the Australian results, measured in confirmed, verified, intelligence-corroborated enemy neutralizations, exceeded those of many American battalions of 800 men operating with 10 times the manpower, 100 times the logistical support, and access to unlimited airstrikes, artillery, and naval gunfire, while the massive American war machine was spraying an average of 50,000 rounds of high-velocity ammunition into the jungle for every single confirmed enemy combatant neutralized. The Australians were achieving the identical result with an average of just 2 carefully aimed bullets, not 2,000, not 200, 2. This was not merely a difference in tactical approach or unit culture. It was devastating, irrefutable mathematical evidence that two entirely different philosophies of warfare were operating side by side in the same theater, producing results so wildly divergent that they called into question every fundamental assumption on which the American war effort in Southeast Asia had been built. The generals and strategists in Washington scratched their heads in bewildered frustration, wondering how a ragged group of sunburned bushmen in tattered, fish sauce-stained jungle greens could consistently and repeatedly outperform the most technologically advanced, most generously funded, most lavishly equipped military force in the entire recorded history of human civilization. They sent investigators looking for high-tech explanations. Perhaps the Australians had access to secret sensors or experimental aircraft or classified intelligence programs that explained their impossible numbers. But the reality was far simpler, far more ancient, and far more humiliating for the architects of the American war machine. Every bullet the SAS fired was a testament to thousands of hours of specialized marksmanship training, months of junglecraft education, and a level of tactical patience that would have psychologically destroyed a conventional American soldier in a single afternoon. And this was the mathematical proof of their absolute superiority in the bush, a cold, unforgiving, inarguable ledger of comparative performance that the world was never supposed to see and that the Pentagon was never supposed to have to explain. But even these staggering numbers concealed a secret so ancient, so primal, and so fundamentally alien to the modern Western military mind that most senior American generals could not even begin to comprehend its power. The true foundation of the Australian SAS's terrifying surgical precision was not found in the high-tech laboratories of the Western defense establishment, not in the gleaming electronics factories of Silicon Valley, and not in the billion-dollar research programs of the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was found in an ancient ancestral power that spanned over 40,000 unbroken years of human survival on the harshest continent on Earth. While the American military was betting its entire Vietnam strategy on motion sensors buried along jungle trails, thermal imaging cameras mounted on aircraft flying at 30,000 feet, and experimental electronic chemical sniffers designed to detect human urine from the air, the Australian SAS was integrating the legendary tracking skills of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia into their core operational doctrine. For an American soldier stomping through the bush in his heavy jungle boots, a bent twig or a slightly bruised leaf meant absolutely nothing in the chaotic, overwhelming green blur of the Vietnamese forest. But for an Australian tracker trained in the Aboriginal tradition, that same bent twig was a detailed, scandalous, deeply intimate biography of the enemy's every movement, intention, and physical condition. The level of forensic detail these bushmen could extract from a single square inch of jungle mud was nothing short of a scientific miracle in the stunned eyes of the American military observers who witnessed it for the first time. They could examine a crushed patch of grass beside a trail and determine with frightening accuracy exactly how many men had passed through the area, which direction they were heading, how heavy their packs were, whether any of them were carrying wounds, and approximately how long ago the last man in the column had placed his foot on that precise spot of earth. A partially displaced pebble beside a stream crossing told them about the foot size and walking speed of the man who had dislodged it. The specific angle at which a spider web had been broken across a trail revealed the approximate height of the soldier who had walked through it, and therefore whether he was a typically shorter local Viet Cong guerrilla or a taller regular North Vietnamese army trooper from the northern provinces. A faint scuff mark on the bark of an exposed tree root indicated whether the man was wearing the rubber sandals favored by the guerrillas or the canvas and leather boots issued to NVA regulars. They were reading the jungle floor the way a master librarian reads the spine of a rare manuscript, extracting a complete narrative from signs that were utterly invisible to the untrained eye. But this ancient capability was about to be tested against the most expensive detection technology the modern world had ever produced, and the result would humiliate a generation of defense contractors. Oh, the American military had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in electronic sensor systems designed to detect enemy movement through the Vietnamese jungle without risking American lives. The most ambitious and most expensive of these programs was the so-called McNamara line, a vast electronic barrier of acoustic sensors, seismic vibration detectors, infrared cameras, and chemical sniffers that Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara personally championed as the technological solution to the infiltration problem along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The system was a spectacular, embarrassing, enormously costly failure. The acoustic sensors triggered false alarms from falling branches, wandering animals, and tropical thunderstorms. The seismic detectors could not distinguish between a column of enemy soldiers and a herd of wild pigs. The chemical sniffers malfunctioned in the extreme humidity and gave positive readings for ammonia compounds naturally present in the decomposing jungle floor. Meanwhile, real Viet Cong supply columns learned to walk between the sensor arrays to avoid the specific trail segments where the devices had been planted, and to use decoy tactics that generated false contacts while the actual cargo moved unmolested along parallel routes. The entire multi-million-dollar system produced a torrent of unreliable data that overwhelmed the analysts at Nakhon Phanom Air Base in Thailand and contributed almost nothing to the actual interdiction of enemy logistics. Meanwhile, a single Aboriginal-trained Australian SAS tracker, equipped with nothing more technologically advanced than his own two naked eyes and a lifetime of training in the art of reading the earth, could follow a 3-day-old trail through terrain so dense and so disturbed by weather that it would have defeated the finest bloodhound in the entire American military K-9 program. He could determine from the condition of a discarded rice wrapper whether an enemy camp was still actively occupied or had been abandoned, and how recently the last cooking fire had been extinguished. He could read the pattern of disturbed leaf litter on the jungle floor to identify the exact location of buried pressure plate mines and hidden booby traps that the most sophisticated electronic mine detectors in the American Engineering Corps inventory consistently failed to find. The bitter, humbling irony was impossible to ignore for anyone willing to look at the evidence honestly. 40,000 years of continuous human evolution on the Australian continent had produced a detection and tracking system that the combined scientific and engineering talent of Silicon Valley, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the entire United States defense industry could not even begin to duplicate. The integration of Aboriginal tracking methodology into the SAS operational doctrine was not a casual nod to cultural heritage or a superficial public relations exercise designed to generate positive headlines back in Canberra. It was a structured, formalized, rigorously maintained program that had its origins in the early 1950s, when the newly formed Australian SAS regiment recognized that the indigenous peoples of the Australian continent possessed a depth of environmental awareness and natural surveillance capability that represented a genuine exploitable military advantage of the highest order. Aboriginal trackers were actively recruited into the regiment, and their ancestral methods of reading terrain, interpreting animal behavior, and following human spoor across seemingly featureless landscapes were studied, scientifically analyzed, codified into training manuals, and systematically woven into the standard selection and continuation training curriculum. Every single SAS operator who deployed to Vietnam had undergone extensive mandatory instruction in visual tracking, spoor interpretation, vegetation disturbance analysis, and environmental awareness techniques that drew directly and explicitly from Aboriginal knowledge systems refined over 400 centuries of unbroken practice. This was not cultural tourism, not token diversity, and not a sentimental gesture toward Australia's Indigenous heritage. It was the deliberate, calculated, cold-blooded weaponization of the oldest continuous wisdom tradition on the face of the planet. The Viet Cong, who had spent years perfecting the art of moving through the jungle without leaving a trace visible to conventional military patrols, discovered to their absolute horror that the Australians were reading their most carefully concealed trails, their most cleverly disguised campsites, and their most meticulously erased footprints as easily and as casually as a highway patrolman in Arizona reads fresh tire tracks on a sun-baked asphalt road. There was simply nowhere left to hide in a jungle that had been turned into an open book by men who could read every page, every paragraph, and every punctuation mark of the forest's silent testimony. The stage was now set for the most incredible display of combined tactical mastery ever recorded in the annals of modern jungle warfare, and the enemy was about to walk directly into it. To truly understand why the North Vietnamese feared these 100 men more than an entire division of regular troops, one must examine the cold-blooded reality of an Australian SAS ambush in the field. Picture a 5-man patrol moving through the long high hills when the Aboriginal tracker at point suddenly raises his closed fist. Every man freezes as if turned to marble. The tracker has detected a Viet Cong unit of 18 fighters approaching along a trail the patrol has been monitoring for 48 hours. In any other military unit on the planet, the commander would immediately call for air support or artillery, but the Australians did not reach for their radios. They simply faded into the emerald shadows like morning mist dissolving into the canopy. The patrol leader selected his ambush position with the precision of a cardiac surgeon choosing the point of incision. A narrow section of trail where dense bamboo on both sides would channel the enemy into a confined corridor of approximately 30 meters. The Claymore mine was positioned to cover the center, its 700 steel ball bearings aimed at chest height. Each rifleman took a position providing overlapping fields of fire. The Aboriginal tracker anchored the far end, watching for reinforcements. Once set, the 5 men ceased to exist as visible entities. Vegetation, mud, scent camouflage, and absolute stillness made them indistinguishable from the jungle floor. For 4 grueling hours, they waited. A green tree viper, one of the most venomous snakes in Southeast Asia, slithered within centimeters of the lead trooper's outstretched hand and eventually moved on. Biting insects found every inch of exposed skin. The men did not react. They had entered the predatory stillness of the Rung. The Viet Cong walked into the trap talking in low voices, weapons slung carelessly, spacing undisciplined, all the hallmarks of a unit that had walked this trail dozens of times without incident. The patrol leader counted 18 fighters through eyes that had been tracking the approach for hours. The lead scouts passed the first concealed position without the slightest awareness that a rifle muzzle was aimed at them from less than 4 meters away, and then the silence was shattered by a storm of fire that no one in the engagement zone could have survived. In exactly 15 seconds, the Claymore detonated first, sending its steel payload through the center of the column at 1,200 meters per second. 4 L1A1 rifles opened fire simultaneously from positions the survivors could not identify. Each trigger pull was deliberate, followed by a brief pause, then another aimed shot. No spray, no suppressive fire, no panic. 14 of the 18 fighters were permanently removed from the conflict. The patrol swept the engagement zone in exactly 90 seconds, collecting documents, maps, and communication equipment of enormous intelligence value. They policed every spent brass casing. Before the cordite smoke cleared, all 5 Australians had vanished. Total expenditure, 47 rounds and 1 claymore. There was no celebration, no radio call, no cheering. The Phantoms simply resumed their silent march. The American intelligence officer monitoring from Nui Dat could not stop comparing this with a search and destroy mission he had observed 3 weeks earlier. That operation required 12 helicopters, 2 infantry companies, over 400 artillery rounds, and 2 F-4 Phantom jets. It lasted 14 hours and produced 7 confirmed neutralizations against 2 American casualties and 1 damaged helicopter. 5 Australians with 47 bullets had achieved twice the result at a cost that was virtually invisible on the balance sheet of war. But the true cost of becoming a phantom was about to be etched into the very souls of the men who survived. The lethality of the forest phantoms came at a psychological price that defies modern clinical understanding. American liaison officers observing these operators returning from deep cover missions saw no typical combat stress, no adrenaline dump. They saw hollow indifference and a chilling absence of human emotion that made their blood run cold. The jungle had rewired these men's neurobiology, transforming them into predators who no longer operated by civilian rules. Coming back through the wire after 14 days as a cold-blooded force of nature was like a deep-sea diver surfacing without decompression. Operators reported 24 to 48 hours of inability to suppress combat awareness, flinching at drop forks in the mess hall, tracking every peripheral movement, bodies coiled for a fight that was no longer there. The regiment's medical officers documented something beyond classic combat fatigue, or what later generations would call post-traumatic stress. These men displayed a permanent alteration of baseline personality, hypervigilance, emotional flatness, inability to connect with normal human feeling. There were also controversial methods in the gray zone between legitimate warfare and something darker, including grim calling cards left as psychological signatures on fallen combatants. Many of these men never truly returned home. Some turned to alcohol, some to isolation, some to tragic endings the Australian government refused to acknowledge for decades. One classified American report posed the question that has never been answered. If a method permanently destroys the men who practice it, is it truly superior or simply a different way of consuming humans as fuel for the engine of war? And yet, the most scandalous betrayal was still hidden in the classified archives. In 1969, an Australian patrol in northern Phuoc Tuy province recovered documents from an abandoned enemy command post that would become one of the most cited intelligence finds of the entire conflict. Among them was a formal directive distributed to all Viet Cong and NVA units in the region, authenticated and immediately classified by both Australian and American intelligence. It ordered all units to avoid contact with Australians at all costs. Engagement was permitted only through mines, booby traps, or rear attacks. Direct combat was explicitly forbidden. The document stated that the Australians fought like jungle guerrillas, an extraordinary admission from an army that considered itself the world's foremost practitioners of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong were conceding in their own official documentation that the Australians had beaten them at their own game. Consider the weight of that admission. An army that expelled the French from Indochina, fought Japan to a standstill, and was currently frustrating the most expensive military machine in human history had officially declared that fewer than 100 Australian operators represented a threat they could not counter. They were willing to face American Marines, American artillery, and American napalm, but they refused to hunt the phantoms. The Rung had fundamentally altered enemy doctrine, creating no-go zones where communist forces simply would not venture. 100 men exercised territorial control that American divisions of 10,000 could not achieve, with all their firepower and all their billions. But the pride of the generals was about to lead to an even greater disaster for thousands of young American families. When the captured directive reached the Pentagon, the response was not what anyone had hoped. Rather than launching an urgent study of Australian methods, the Pentagon buried the findings in a classified vault. No training exchange was established, no doctrinal review initiated. The reasons were unforgivable: institutional pride and structural dependency on the firepower paradigm. The suggestion that men from a country smaller than New York State had solved the central challenge of Vietnam was simply too humiliating. This entire military-industrial complex was organized around overwhelming force and could not accommodate a lesson that required patience, silence, and 5-man patrols instead of billion-dollar bombing campaigns. The cost was measured in lives. American forces continued with noisy, predictable search-and-destroy tactics, while the proven Australian methods gathered dust in Pentagon archives. It was not until the 1980s and 90s, with the formation of Delta Force and the reorganization of the Navy SEALs, that America finally recognized what the Australians had demonstrated 2 decades earlier. The methods Colonel David Hackworth praised in 1969 became standard American procedure in 2003. The distance between those two dates is not measured in years. It is measured in 58,000 names etched into a black granite wall in Washington, D.C. The record of 500 neutralized for every single Australian loss will never be repeated in the history of human conflict. It remains a haunting mathematical ghost that mocks conventional warfare and exposes the catastrophic arrogance of generals who refuse to learn from 100 men in tattered jungle greens. The Rung were the ultimate proof that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield is not a billion-dollar bomber, but a human being willing to disappear into the shadows and wait for the perfect, tragic moment. Their legacy is written in the terrifying silence they left behind, a silence that still speaks volumes about the true nature of power and the irreversible cost of becoming a legend. And so, the phantoms remain exactly where they belong, in the shadows of history, watching and fading.